Welcome to the Virginia Cooperative Extension Plant Clinic, all about veggies. These plant clinics are sponsored by the Virginia Cooperative Extension Program of Virginia's two land-grant universities, Virginia Tech and Virginia State Universities. These plant clinics are staffed by Master Gardeners from the Fairfax County Master Gardeners Association that share science-based information about gardening and horticulture topics. So these topics are all ways to discover how to care for your garden effectively and efficiently, no matter its format or location. I'm going to turn it over next to Sylvia Liu, who's here to talk about best practices for watering your garden, something that might be a little bit more complex than we think. So Sylvia, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sylvia Liu. So we're going to talk about how to water your garden today. I'm sure everyone knows that moisture is very important for plants, and it's very important for crop growth. A healthy plant is somewhere between 75% to 90% water, and the plant requires water to do a lot of its vital functions such as photosynthesis and also transportation of nutrients and sugars throughout the plant. There are certain times where watering is more important than other times. One of those very crucial times that a plant needs watering is during its first 2 weeks of growth, because during that time the plant is developing root systems, and its root systems is going to help it absorb nutrients and help it grow. So if there's too little water during that time, the seedling might die actually. Or if there's too much water, then the roots are not growing far enough from the plant, not moving out into the soil in search of water and nutrients. So you just need right amount of water, not too much and not too little. So without a very sufficient root system during the hot, dry season, which is what we have now, the plant might have issues. So as I said before, there are critical periods during which a plant needs water. The first of that period is germination of seeds, and then immediately after transplanting, also during the first 2 weeks of development, and then also during the development of fruits. That's when watering is most critical. So how do we know how much to water our plants? A good rule is that a vegetable plant needs about 1 inch of water per week. So that's water including rainwater as well as irrigation water. Some vegetables such as tomatoes and cantaloupes requires a lot more water, about 2 inches of water per week, especially during fruit production. When is a good time to water your plants? When you start seeing the top few inches of the soil beginning to dry, that is a sign to you that it's time to water. As I mentioned before, a plant needs about 1 to 2 inches of water per week. So that means that the soil should be moist about 5 to 6 inches. So sometimes people would put their fingers into the soil to see if the soil is still moist or not. So that's a good gauge for you to know if it's time to water. So there are basically two different types of watering methods. The first one, which is the most common, is overhead watering. So that's when you see someone with a sprinkling can going over to a tomato plant watering, that would be overhead watering. Sometimes people will use some sort of hose with a spray attachment, as you see on this picture. That's also overhead watering. So the second type of watering method is called drip or trickle irrigation. So instead of having a spray or a sprinkling can watering with those equipments, instead there will be hoses or tapes that would slowly drip water onto the plant. So drip irrigation is more effective in terms of water use than sprinkler system, than overhead watering. Drip irrigation is about 90% effective in terms of water usage, whereas the overhead watering system is only about 50 to 70%. And that is because drip irrigation minimizes water loss due to runoff, wind, and evaporation. There are essentially two different types of drip irrigation. You can use soaker hose, or you can use some sort of emitter type of system. So here are some example of soaker hoses of all different price points. But essentially they do the same thing. It's a hose, and there are holes in this hose. So as you turn on the water, these hose will essentially leak water onto the soil. And then you have the emitter type of system, which is similar, but it's almost like a mini sprinkler system that's attached to these hose. And that would also bring the water directly to the plant. So here's some tips that are helpful with watering. The first one is you don't want to wet the leaves of any plants in the evening, because when the leaves are wet in the evening, the leaves are unlikely to become dry, and that would encourage disease forming on the leaves and then maybe attacking the plant. The best time to water really is early morning, because during early morning it's not too hot, so when you water, the water doesn't evaporate from the soil quickly. But also because if it's in the morning, then if the leaves do get wet, they will have a chance to dry, and that way it won't encourage disease forming on the plant. Here are some of the resources that I looked at in putting this presentation together. They're very helpful. If you have time, I encourage you to take a look at them. I think my one final thought is watering is important, and there are many different ways to do it. You just have to find a method that you can do easily and that fits your plan for your garden. Back to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's great information. You know, those soaker hoses are so useful for our garden, especially as the rain is drying out for the season. So our next presenter tonight is Terry Bachman, and she's going to tell us a little bit about weeding and mulching in your garden. So Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. My name is Terry Bachman. I'm a first-year Master Gardener, and tonight I'll speak for a few minutes about weeds, and I think it's a great topic. And it's been my experience that it's one of the most common walk-up questions at plant clinics. So what's the best way to control weeds? Or when I have friends in my garden, they ask, I don't see any weeds. How do you keep up with weeds? But to all these open-ended questions, I have 3 points. First, regarding my own garden, anyone and everyone, I'll recommend my garden, and if you see a weed, pull it. That's a sign of a true gardener who is willing to pull garden weeds from any garden. Second point about weeds, your best offense is defense. That means having a healthy and desirable plants taking up space in your garden plots. You'll have less weeds then, so get planting. And lastly, but probably most importantly, my third point is always to have realistic expectations about weeds. Total eradication or an absence of weeds is probably unrealistic and requires too much time and energy. So it's about keeping up with your weeds, keeping them in check. And we all know about the tipping point when a garden goes from having some weeds to it being a weed garden. So tonight we'll discuss ways to keep your garden, your vegetable garden weeds in check and hopefully have a garden closer to the dream garden rather than a weed garden. Another interesting question I often get at the clinic is, what's a weed anyway? And that's a really good question because there's not a strict definition, but according to the Penn State Extension website, some definitions include a plant that's out of place and not intentionally sown, a plant that grows where it's not wanted or welcomed. I like this one, a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. And that's actually a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. But in general, I'd say a weed is a plant that's competitive, persistent, pernicious, interferes negatively with human activity, meaning that it's competing against the plants we want to thrive in our garden and out-competing those plants for precious resources, the sun, the water, the soil nutrients, and the air needed for our vegetables. So we're going to talk about weed control, and specifically, we're going to talk about 2 different realms of weed control. The first one is prevention or pre-emergent, where we're trying to control weeds before they germinate, figuring out how to stop or limit germination. And the second realm is eradication, or I'd prefer to say management, which is post-emergence, which is what to do to kill or to remove weed plants after they germinate. And now I want to stop for a minute and acknowledge an important aspect of tonight's presentation about weeds. Of course, this is an all about veggies presentation. So the focus is weeds in a vegetable garden. So a special consideration has to be made to weed management, given that we want to ingest the products of these gardens. And as such, and although there can be some exceptions, chemical solutions, both pre-emergent and post-emergent, should be limited or avoided. And chemical solutions, in general, I'm not providing chemical solutions as or chemical options as recommended solutions tonight. If you are going to use chemical solutions or chemical herbicides, my message is read any and all the labels and make sure that they are appropriate, because even though they say that they're safe or they're organic, it may not be appropriate for the types of vegetables or fruits and vegetables you're planning for, and they might not be effective. I encourage you to, particularly for vegetable gardens, to try some of these other options that don't involve chemicals. So I'm going to talk about some of the non-chemical pre-emergent weed control methods. And specifically, I know this presentation, part of this presentation is the importance of mulching and how important that is. So generally, mulch is any applied barrier of organic matter, double shredded hardwood, compost, straw, wood chips, etc. Even newspaper can be effective weed barrier when 3 or 4 layers are much more than that, and you might limit oxygen to the plant's root systems. So very important that your mulch is not a source of weed seed, though. So credible sourcing is very important on that front. Fabric barriers, the picture on the right is, although I don't have a personal experience with this, I noted that fabric barriers, it can be an effective way of preventing weeds. As a rule, home gardeners should opt for permeable mesh fabric so that it allows nutrients and water to come through. Problematic part of weed fabric barriers, though, is the securing the fabric to the soil, which often takes quite a bit of time with soil staples or other staking methods, but it is effective. Thirdly, if you have the time for it, another technique I noted in my research for this presentation was solarization. And again, although I have no personal experience with this technique, if you are planning for a late summer or early fall vegetable garden planting, solarization can be very effective, not only for weeds, but insects and other plant diseases. So to solarize your soil, it's best to have deeply tilled soil, saturate the soil with water, and apply sheets of clear plastic. And after the plastic has been stretched and pinned down, the plastic cover should remain in place for a minimum of a month, 2 months being even more effective. So clearly that takes some time and planning, and we don't often have that much time, but that has been shown to be a very effective way of killing weed seed in your soil, as well as, again, I mentioned that it kills insect larvae, etc. And then lastly, I'm going to spend some more time on this fourth way, which is a no-till or strip till method. And this came up in one of our most recent series of Master Gardener classes. And this was intriguing to me. So we had Lee Reich as our speaker, and his recommendation for a weedless garden, and he emphasized that it's not weedless, but weedless. Again, emphasizing that idea of having realistic expectations about weeds, is that in undisturbed soil, there's a lot of reasons to leave your soil undisturbed. And these two images on the right show some reasons for how they work together very well with undisturbed mulched soil. The first image in the middle shows that when moisture is applied to undisturbed soil, it moves down through capillary reasons. It moves down, across, and up, and really is much better available to root systems than when it is in tilled soil, which basically lets the water run all the way through. And then to the importance of having a mulched surface, a mulched untilled surface. This picture demonstrates how important the mulching is to regulating the temperature of the soil and moderating the temperature soil, which makes for better root growth, as well as helping any rain or watering to, again, filtrate into the water at a better rate, where a untilled soil surface can often pit or splash water away and not bring that to our desired plants. So what does this look like? And what I'm showing you here is a picture from Lee Reich's presentation of his garden beds and his vegetable beds. And so on the left, he's cleaned up his spent plants, minimizing soil disturbance by removing only the stems and large roots. And that's about it. Like, cleanup is just very focused, again, on not disturbing the soil. And then he leaves it to rest with, again, not tilling the soil at all. When it comes time that he wants to do his plantings, he uses strips of wood or metal to create the borders for his planting area. And then he fills in with about 1 or 2 inches of rich organic matter. He puts down his drip irrigation system, similar to those that Sylvia was talking about, and he plants his seedlings directly into the compost or through into the soil surface. So all of this sounded too good to be true, but it certainly has caught my attention and is the method that I'm employing now, and not just in vegetable gardens, but even in many of my annual beds, where I've limited how much I turn the soil over. I had always thought it was important to aerate the soil, but in order to limit how much we're fighting against the weeds, no-till is the way to go. And by the way, strip tilling is essentially the same idea, just that the only part you would till would be a single line down the middle of your bed and plant therein. And then finally, when some of those weeds do break through, how do you manage that? And here it's mostly about the scale of your garden. Again, Lee Reich suggests that weeding should mean to remove only the tops of your weeds, and only large roots for large weeds, using a flat, sharp blade like the Dutch hoe on the right, just below the soil surface, to cut off the tops of the weeds and to get the light weeds. Or one of my favorite tools for digging out a more stubborn deep root is a hori-hori knife, which has blades on both sides, serrated and sharp, and can get to a specific part of a root. Then another method is flame weeding, which are burning your weeds, which of course there's several propane or butane tools on the market, but just be careful, because that should be done in an area where you wouldn't have any flammable materials. So that you should be very careful of. I actually find that to work really well on stone walkways rather than in a garden place, but that's my experience with burning weeds. And then lastly, I just encourage people to take weeding one day at a time, and to just have weeding, pulling a few weeds as part of your daily walk around to your garden, as you enjoy your garden with your coffee, your glass of wine, your glass of water, and to just pull and throw away those weeds, a few weeds, to keep them in check, so that you too can have a garden that's mostly weed-free and not a weed garden. Here's my list of references for my research for this evening.
All right, well, thank you, Terry. Those are some great tips that you shared. I especially like the advice that you should have a full garden to help ward off weeds. I think that is something that all of us who are plant enthusiasts and garden lovers will find very easy to take to heart. I'm going to turn it over next to Margaret Wilson, who's going to talk about how some of these maintenance practices apply in community gardens. So Margaret, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to draw a little bit on the wisdom that we've just heard and do a summing up. One of the things that's different in the garden is it's a little bit more difficult to just sort of step out the door in the morning with your coffee and pull a few weeds or do a little bit of watering. So your gardening has to be a little bit more long-term. You want to make your weeding and your watering efforts hold the line for a little bit longer. And one of the best ways to do that is to incorporate an awful lot of mulching, so that if you can't get to your garden every day, you know that the mulching is going to help with the watering and the water conservation and the weed reduction by sort of holding the fort until you can get there. The best thing about mulching is that it will help you, if you have 2 to 4 inches of organic mulch covering your garden beds, it will reduce the evaporation by shading the soil. It will, again, maintain consistent moisture and allow even filtration of the water during rainfall or watering. It also will minimize erosion during an extreme rainfall, as we may get over the next few hours. Importantly, for a situation like tonight, when we expect a big amount of rain falling, that it will reduce the water splash when watering or from a heavy rain. Mulch also will reduce weeds, as we've heard. It creates a barrier to weed seed germination. It retains the soil moisture. It makes it easier to pull weeds with long tap roots or spreading rhizomes. And it is a great insulator for the soil. Again, it's a moderator. It keeps plant roots at a constant or consistent temperature. Shredded bark alone or piled on top of cardboard and newspaper will minimize weeds in walking areas or along fences. This is especially important in community garden spaces because frequently you're not just, the effects of your gardening practices don't just relate to your own space, they have a definite impact on the person next to you. So you're going to want to do a fair amount of mulching along those fence areas that you share, just to make sure that whatever you're doing does not impact negatively on the person next to you, and hope that they do the same. One of the other ways that you can reduce weeds in a garden plot is you can plant in blocks. I was doing some reading this weekend about a Vermont gardener, and one of the things that he suggested was put all your beans and things and legumes in one nice square block, and just their foliage alone will create a canopy and discourage weeds. And then so you'll have fewer weeds in that spot, fewer weed seeds. And then next year you can move the beans or vegetables that create more shade to another area and put things like carrots or radishes that don't have the intense kind of canopy and foliage that beans do. So you can rotate your spaces that way. So where does one find mulch? We are very lucky in Fairfax County to have a good supply of mulch in various places. We can get them at certain community gardens. The Barron Cameron Community Garden, Lewinsville, Pine Ridge, and Gristmill Community Gardens all have a regular delivery of mulch to them. Also, you can find it at the Bull Run Regional Park or the I-95 and I-66 citizens recycling facilities. One of the things I'd like to recommend is, I would like to recommend that people actually go visit a community garden. We have 671 community garden plots in Fairfax County at 9 different parks. And I think if you are on the waiting list, or if you're considering getting a garden plot, or you have your own garden and you'd like to see how other people manage their gardens, it's an absolutely delightful way to spend a couple hours by just dropping into these gardens and seeing how people garden next to each other. Community gardens are more than about raising food. It is about working together, sort of chatting over the fence, learning new gardening tips, finding out how people do things, and just understanding, just having a community of friends around your garden space. And here are the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I think that's great, a great overview, and along with Sylvia and Terry's presentations, a lot for us to think about and some good maintenance tips for us as we hit the peak of the summer.
I have one, and I would like to ask Margaret, do you use the free mulch or do you have a mulch that you prefer to use?
I am not gardening this year. I don't have my own garden. I've observed my son's garden, and he is buying bagged mulch from Meadows Farms. It's just a very basic mulch that he uses, and he piles it on about 2 inches thick. Don't forget that you can also use green manures later in the season. Once you have started to clean up your garden, you can install in the walkways, you can plant green manures like rye and buckwheat, and then have those, try to do that about 2 weeks before you expect a frost so it can set up, and then let it go through the winter, and then you can till it in.
Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you.
I have another consideration. I think we're coming up to, after we get through July, we're coming up to a tremendous season of gardening where we've been very good about keeping our gardens tidy and weeded and watered. And when you get closer to harvest, gardens take on a will of their own. They just grow with abandon. And I think you have to look at that in a certain way. I think of people who try to stake their tomato plants, and probably it doesn't hurt just to let them fall over a little bit because they create shade, they reduce evaporation. But I encourage people to enjoy that part of their garden, especially that season.
I think that's great advice. All of us to have realistic expectations. No one's expecting your gardens to look like a garden magazine all the time, and plants do what they want. Each season is a different experience. So thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you to all our presenters tonight for their great information. I want to thank our presenters again for their time tonight. Lots of great information was shared. And I'm going to go through a couple other resources that we've been covering this year that you might find helpful as you're looking through your garden. So we've been talking about garden journaling. This is something that we're trying to encourage all of us to do, just so you can track what works, what doesn't, what bugs you're seeing, if your raspberry leaves are yellowing this year, or if you're having to water more than usual. It's just a way to kind of track the rhythms of the gardening season. And then, as we're putting our garden to bed for the fall, we're going to talk about reviewing your garden journal and how you use some of those observations as you go forth into the next planting season. So we're always thinking about our next garden. We have a bit of a lull right now between spring and high summer, but what are you harvesting? What are you seeing in your garden? What are the patterns, that sort of thing. There are also a bunch of different templates if you do a web search for it. You can also just use a notebook, so any format that works for you. And these videos have been recorded since the summer of 2020, and they're all available on our YouTube site. So you can scroll through there, see, you can see here the screenshot. We have topics about flea beetles, lady beetles, things like that. So you can find information about the topics that you're searching for. So I just want to thank you again for attending tonight, for dropping in and taking an hour of your time to listen to us. And if you're watching the recording, thank you for doing that as well. And I really hope that we'll see you at future clinics. We have a lot of great information for you, and please think about joining us in the future. Thank you so much.